The Manhattan skyline was beginning to be tinged with twilight. In the offices of Goldstein and Partners, Margaret Reynolds was reviewing the last quarterly report. Her long blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail and sharp eyes behind intellectual black-rimmed glasses scanned the numbers on the screen. Her simple yet elegant navy pantsuit accentuated her dignified bearing. As a senior analyst, her judgment had always been precise. This was true not only in the world of investment, but also in life, even if it meant parting ways with her beloved family. 3 years ago, she discovered improper accounting practices at Reynolds Construction Incorporated, run by her father, William Reynolds. Known as a pillar of the construction industry, her father maintained an obstinate pride behind his gentle smile. That Sunday, during their regular family dinner at Peter Luger Steakhouse in Brooklyn, he had maintained his calm demeanor as he said, "This is to protect the company." But Maggie hadn't missed the anxiety in his eyes. Wrong is wrong, no matter the reason. That night's family meeting felt like a trial. In the living room of their Greenwich mansion, her mother Elizabeth, with perfect hair and makeup, sat gracefully on the expensive sofa, fixing her daughter with an icy stare. Dressed in a Chanel tweed jacket, she looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury brand advertisement. "Why would you bring shame to the family? What will happen to our social standing?" For her mother, life revolved around their elegant existence in their Round Hill Road mansion and the weekly social gatherings. While tending to her garden roses, she carefully maintained relationships with neighboring dignitaries, unable to comprehend her daughter's actions. Her sister Victoria, dressed in the latest fashion, reproached Maggie indignantly. "You've always been so inflexible, sister. Even now. You've always found fault with my choice of marriage partner too." Her father's anger exploded quietly but surely. His silver hair trembled slightly as his tall, thin frame became even more rigid. "You are no longer a daughter of this house." With those words, Maggie's life changed dramatically. In her comfortable apartment on East 76th Street, she began forging her own path. As a career woman earning $180,000 a year, she lived honestly, accepting help from no one. On holidays, she would walk in Central Park and sometimes immerse herself in art at the Metropolitan Museum. It was different from the luxurious vacations with her family, but it brought its own genuine sense of fulfillment. The exchange of Christmas cards ceased, and all contact with her family was completely cut off. Her mother continued to enjoy shopping at Bergdorf Goodman and Saks Fifth Avenue, devoting herself to social parties. Her sister ran a high-end boutique called Victoria's Choice, with their parents' support, receiving generous assistance on top of her $120,000 annual income. And her father. Occasionally, Maggie would remember her father's silver hair and tall, thin figure, and her heart would tighten. Memories of childhood days when he held her hand walking through Central Park, the times he taught her about the wonders of art at the Metropolitan Museum. There had been genuine love there, surely. Though she believed she had done the right thing, she couldn't help feeling a deep loneliness. As twilight deepened, the office lights went out one by one. While tidying up her documents, Maggie thought about how tomorrow would bring another new day. Spring sunlight streamed through the large office windows. Maggie was absorbed in her investment analysis report when her eyes caught the headlines on a news site, making her hands freeze. Reynolds Construction Incorporated founder William Reynolds dies suddenly of heart attack. The words on the screen seemed to dance before her eyes. Heart attack. The funeral would be tomorrow at 10 a.m. at St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. Her fingers trembled as she tried to close the browser. Her father's smile suddenly came back to her with vivid clarity. The last time she'd seen him was on that night of the family meeting. "You are no longer a daughter of this house," those words still echoed in her ears. With concerned glances from her subordinates at her back, Maggie submitted a request for early leave. Returning to her Upper East Side apartment, she took out a black dress from her closet. She could almost hear her mother's voice. "Really, Maggie, such a plain dress will disgrace the Reynolds name." That night, she couldn't sleep at all. Outside her window, Manhattan's nightlights twinkled. Had her father thought of her in his final moments? The next morning, St. Patrick's Cathedral was shrouded in a heavy atmosphere. The cathedral's spires reached endlessly upward. Maggie parked her car 2 blocks away. With trembling legs, she slowly approached the cathedral. A line of luxury cars arrived one after another. Aunt Mary from her mother's side, Cousin James, industry leaders, their gazes seemed to have physical form as they pierced Maggie. Her elegant black dress and the pearl necklace inherited from her grandmother should have been worthy of the Reynolds name. But the surrounding eyes were cold. "Isn't that the disowned daughter? Surely she's not here for the inheritance?" But Maggie began climbing the steps straight ahead. Suddenly, her arm was grabbed, and 2 security guards blocked her path. The men in black suits wore expressions mixing confusion and duty. "I'm sorry, but this area is restricted to family members only." Maggie tried to respond as calmly as possible, though her voice trembled slightly. "I am the deceased's daughter, Margaret Reynolds." Just then, an elegant laugh rang out from the top of the stairs. Turning around, there stood her mother. In perfect black mourning attire, holding an Hermes bag, with beautiful makeup incongruous with the occasion. Next to her stood Victoria, clothed in the latest Prada. Her mother's voice was as light as a spring breeze, yet sharp as a blade. "This doesn't concern you, does it? You abandoned your family 3 years ago. How despicable to come here hoping for inheritance." Victoria's shrill voice echoed off the cathedral walls. "Leave at once." The security guards were clearly uncomfortable. One murmured, "Miss, I'm sorry, but..." Maggie struggled to steady her trembling voice. "I just want to say goodbye to Father." Her mother waved her hand gracefully, like summoning a waiter at a party. "Security, please remove this woman." Over 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on Maggie. Construction industry leaders, relatives, her father's old friends. While some gazes held sympathy, no one spoke up. Maggie turned around slowly, straightening her back to maintain dignity. She descended the steps one at a time. Behind her, her sister's shrill laughter followed. The walk back to her car felt eternal. Her hands shook on the steering wheel. As she started the engine and looked up at the cathedral through the window, tears finally rolled down her cheeks. Indescribable feelings swirled in her chest. Sadness, anger, regret, and a strange certainty. This wasn't the end. Something significant was about to begin. Manhattan's sky remained covered in gray clouds. Maggie slowly pressed the accelerator. The cathedral's pointed spires grew smaller in her rearview mirror. This was how her final farewell to her father had turned out. But was this really the end? In Maggie's heart, a quiet voice echoed, seeking answers. When the eastern sky began to brighten, Maggie awoke, realizing she had been lying sleepless in bed all night. Outside her window, Manhattan's cityscape was wrapped in morning mist. The day after the funeral. As the surreal morning light filled her apartment, she noticed an envelope that had been slipped under her door just as she was about to turn on the coffee maker. A high-quality paper envelope. On the front was written, "Ms. Margaret Reynolds," in elegant handwriting. The sender was Harrison and Williams Law Firm, her father's longtime legal counsel. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were a formal notice from the firm and another envelope. This one bore her father's handwriting, to Maggie. The firm's notice contained information about her father's personal office. 15th floor of an old office building in Midtown. There is a safe that only you can open. She opened her father's letter. The yellowed stationery still held a faint scent of Old Spice. The smell of her father's favorite cologne made her chest tighten. To my beloved daughter Maggie. My stubbornness robbed us of 3 years together. Now I realize how proud I am of your courage back then. Honest, sincere, and strong, you were everything my daughter should be. Please open the safe I left in the Greenwich house. The combination is your birthday. This is my final gift to you. With love. Father. Tears fell onto the letters. She tried hurriedly to wipe them away, but they wouldn't stop. Outside the window, the morning sun began to shine between the skyscrapers. That afternoon, Maggie headed to her father's personal office. The 15th floor was silent. This place where her father had worked almost every day. The leather sofa in the reception room, construction site photos on the walls, family pictures on the desk, everything remained as it was 3 years ago. In the photos, the whole family was still smiling. Picnics in Central Park, vacations in Cape Cod, Christmas parties. Even photos from the Mother's Day surprise party she and her sister had secretly prepared. Back then, everything had been different. Opening her father's desk drawer, she found an old key. The key to the safe in the study of their Greenwich house. As she held it, she could almost feel her father's warmth still lingering. At dusk, Maggie headed to the Greenwich house. Round Hill Road was as quiet as ever, lined with elegant mansions. No one was around the house. Her mother and sister were probably still busy with their duties as chief mourners. Her father's study was at the end of the second floor. Opening the thick mahogany door, a familiar scent of leather and old books wafted out. The safe was behind the bookshelf. She remembered when, as a child, her father had led her into this room and told her, "There are important things kept here." Moving the bookshelf revealed the old safe. Faint traces of rust on the dulled metal. With trembling fingers, she entered the combination. 0-7-1-5, July 15th, Maggie's birthday. With a click, the safe door opened. Inside were 3 document files neatly arranged. The top blue file contained a life insurance policy. Only Margaret's name was listed as the beneficiary. The amount was $500,000. Records showed premiums had been paid without fail every month for 20 years. The next red file was a trust fund certificate. A trust property of $300,000. Again, Maggie was the sole beneficiary. Looking at the establishment date, it was the day she entered college. Next to her father's signature was written, "For my daughter's future." The last yellow file contained mutual fund securities. Total value, $200,000. All invested in secure vehicles, with taxes fully paid. Her father's note on a post-it read, "For times of need." And at the very bottom, an envelope. To Maggie. This money is what I've accumulated bit by bit over 30 years. It's not company assets, nor subject to any debt. I prepared all of this for you. You were right when you pointed out the company's wrongdoing back then. But I had my pride and responsibilities. To protect the company, to protect the employees, I made the wrong choice. I'm proud of your honesty and integrity. I still regret driving you away over the company's problems. This is my final gift to you. Use it wisely. And someday, I hope these feelings will reach you. With love. Father. Outside the window, the sun was setting. Long evening shadows stretched across the quiet Greenwich residential area. Maggie sat at her father's desk and let out a deep sigh. What thoughts had her father carried in this room? The pressure of the company, responsibility to family, and thoughts of his estranged daughter. Carrying it all until his final moments. As she carefully packed the safe's contents into her bag, Maggie had made up her mind. She couldn't let these feelings go to waste. That night, Maggie sat by the window in her Upper East Side apartment, reading her father's letter over and over. Manhattan's night lights looked blurred in the rain. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. The clock had passed 11 p.m. Through the peephole, she saw unexpected visitors. Her mother Elizabeth and sister Victoria. Neither showed their usual elegant bearing. When she opened the door, fatigue showed through her mother's light makeup. Her Hermes bag was wet from the rain, having lost its usual luster. Her sister's eyes were swollen, and her latest fashion now only gave an impression of vulnerability. "Please, Maggie, help us." Her mother's voice trembled like never before. Maggie silently invited them in. Her once elegant mother collapsed onto the sofa and began crying. Her sister stood by the window, staring out at the rain. What happened? Maggie's voice was unintentionally cold. Her mother began explaining through tears. Reynolds Construction Incorporated's financial situation was more serious than imagined. The debt, it's $25 million. Maggie caught her breath at the number. Her mother continued with details. $15 million from a failed construction project. $8 million in operating loans. $2 million in other liabilities. Did father provide personal guarantees too? Victoria turned around at Maggie's question. $5 million. He even put the Greenwich house up as collateral. Victoria's voice had lost its former sharp tone. But isn't the company incorporated? Yes. But father, to protect the company, he even put up his personal assets. Her mother's words trailed off. The sound of rain filled the momentary silence. 3 years ago. Maggie slowly began. When I pointed out the company's problems, her mother's makeup continued to run. Her sister pressed her forehead against the window, her shoulders beginning to shake. I'm sorry, we were wrong. Victoria's voice came out thin. If we had only listened to you then. Her mother covered her face. What are you asking for now? Maggie's voice was surprisingly calm. Her mother looked up. Her mascara had run. The bankruptcy trustee, they're coming tomorrow. The Greenwich house, Victoria's choice, everything. Even my boutique? Her sister's voice cracked. It's only been open 2 years. Maggie slowly stood up and headed to the kitchen. While making hot tea, she remembered her father's words. This money is what I've accumulated bit by bit over 30 years. Use it wisely. When she brought the tea, her mother and sister looked surprised, as if they had expected Maggie to throw them out. Let's talk, Maggie said quietly. But there are conditions. Her mother and sister held their breath, watching her. First, show me all the management documents. And Maggie took a breath. Let's change the company's management approach from the ground up. Do you understand about running a company? Her mother's voice still held traces of her former arrogance. I'm a senior analyst at Goldstein and Partners. I see how good companies are rebuilt in the investment world every day. There was quiet confidence in Maggie's voice. Suddenly, her sister broke down crying. Sister, I'm sorry. Even at the funeral, saying such horrible things. Her mother also wiped away tears and said in a trembling voice, how could we have been so arrogant? Maggie silently watched them both. Outside the window, the rain was gradually letting up. Manhattan's night lights were beginning to regain their sparkle. Father left something for us. Maggie chose her words carefully. But to use it, we need to make some promises. Her mother and sister looked at her as if seeking salvation. First, complete information disclosure. Second, management transparency. And third, Maggie took a deep breath. Acknowledge past mistakes and build a new company together. The rain had completely stopped. Outside the window, stars were beginning to appear in Manhattan's night sky. That autumn, the leaves were beginning to turn in the garden of the Greenwich mansion. Elizabeth, her mother, was tending to the roses herself instead of the former luxury gardeners. Though her movements were still awkward, her expression held a strange satisfaction. Mother, it's time for the board meeting. When Maggie came to the garden to call her, her mother hurriedly brushed off the soil and rushed to change. The Reynolds Construction Incorporated boardroom no longer held its former imposing atmosphere. Instead, transparent glass walls and an open environment filled the space. Let's begin the third quarter financial report. As Maggie started her presentation, all attendees listened with serious expressions. Particularly Victoria's gaze was sharp, following each number carefully. Loan repayments are proceeding as scheduled, operating profit is up 15% year-over-year, and new project orders are steady. This was a scene unimaginable just 6 months ago. After that rainy night, events moved rapidly. Maggie decided to invest the $1 million inherited from her father in rebuilding the company. However, this came with strict conditions. Complete information disclosure and management transparency. Her mother and sister agreed without hesitation. They too had reached the point of no return. The debt repayment plan made great progress thanks to Maggie's financial knowledge and negotiation skills. After persistent discussions with creditors, they succeeded in easing the repayment terms. Most importantly, reforms began to fundamentally change the company's culture. Our strength lies in our 50 years of experience. Maggie spoke powerfully at the board meeting. But we can't rest on those laurels. We must be reborn as a construction company for a new era, emphasizing transparency and compliance. Her mother nodded slightly at these words. Her former haughty attitude had faded, replaced by a humble willingness to learn. On weekends, she participated in local charity activities, beginning to build relationships with new communities. Victoria's transformation was even more dramatic. She sold her high-end boutique and decided to work for a regular company. "I'll learn from the basics," she said with sincere determination. Now she was earnestly absorbing knowledge about the construction industry. The heavy atmosphere that once filled the company hallways had disappeared. Employees could freely express opinions and suggest new ideas in the improved environment. If Father could see this, he'd be so happy. Mother said softly one evening during a family dinner. Dining at Peter Luger Steakhouse had become a monthly tradition. The three women confirmed their new bonds at this place filled with memories of their father. Victoria sheepishly spoke up. "I'm truly sorry for what I said back then, about you coming for the inheritance." Maggie smiled gently. "That's in the past. We have our future ahead of us." The Greenwich mansion changed gradually. Some of the luxurious furnishings were sold, replaced by warmer, more comfortable furniture. Mother's proud garden parties were transformed into venues for local charitable activities. The biggest change was the weekly Sunday family meetings. Unlike the former formal gatherings, the three would now exchange frank opinions and sometimes engage in heated discussions. However, a deep trust had grown beneath it all. Father's study remained as a place where all three could gather anytime. The safe behind the bookshelf was no longer used. Instead, new family photos adorned the walls. Holidays at the Metropolitan Museum, picnics in Central Park, Thanksgiving dinner. The three women in the photos showed more natural smiles than ever before. One night, Maggie spoke to her father's photograph. "We've finally become a real family." Outside the window, the autumn breeze gently stirred the garden roses. Though they had lost their former splendor, their fragrance had grown deeper. It was as if it represented the journey this family had taken.